Okay, I think I'm pretty much set.
Okay.
My blue paper.
There we go. All right, there you are.
Put this over here. Slow. Has there been much this, or we can talk about this later too. Has there been much on the Discord? My Discord's not working right
Not really. I mean, I haven't seen anyone post anything since I think you were on there.
now. Okay.
So I think I posted a response to you, and then
Yeah, I haven't looked. I looked at it and then I haven't added much to it yet, but I plan to. Because I think that'll be kind of a. I think that'll be more active in the weeks ahead.
yeah.
Is it showing for you that I have a poor connection, internet-wise?
No, I don't see anything bad. Well, yeah, actually, it looks red.
Yeah, I don't really know why that is, but well.
Is it still loading? Or oh, I can't hear you now.
Sorry.
Okay.
Here, yes.
All right. You want me to go first with some things, or
I can just start since
okay?
it'll probably be interesting for other people to get my things out of the way and do your stuff.
Yeah.
I'll go quickly and just share some stuff. Basically, let me pull this up too. For me, you pretty much know, so I'll just go over some things.
Yeah. I mean, what we can go over other things. People watch it later and see, or they can engage with it offline. But
Yeah. Um, Basically, what's been up to this week? I'll just generally share my screen.
all right.
Here. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
That's the wrong one. That's not the screen that I wanted to share. And I have to go here to close it. Okay. Alright. So, for things that's going on this week, I'll just kind of start from GitHub and go from there. If you can see, I think you can see this paper here actually in this corner.
Yeah. Yeah.
That that actually, I don't know if I put that in our Slack or not, but nope. Well, this is a link that also came up this week that looks pretty cool. I'm gonna check this out regarding some Cognition stuff. But I think he's basically questioning. It's sort of a critical look at evolutionary psychology and it's how it deals with addressing certain things. So it's kind of a one of my good friend of mine posted it, and I'm looking forward to looking into that. The paper actually is what I posted in this Telegram chat, which I'll now bring into the light here.
All right.
The paper is active inference and activism and the hermeneutics of social cognition. And this is a cool paper, and I'm kind of bringing everybody who wants to come into it. it's kind of a good friend of mine. Through our lab mate, dear friend Anson, I found a journal club a long time ago, in the last year, and they basically are restarting. So I'm going to invite anybody from the Cognition study group to come and join. All of us talking about this paper, basically. And you can see here, it's actually called the Interdisciplinary Humanities Reading Group. And it's local to Western Michigan University, but this is kind of a list of stuff that we've been doing in the past. And so next Friday at 3 p.m., if anybody wants to look at that paper, we have it available here. If you can, I think it's free to download from the website, but we will be doing that next week, and that's sort of a nice little joint venture, and it'd be good to reconnect with all those people, because there are a lot of interesting, smart people there. So that's one thing out of the way. In general, the Cognition study group, whoops, I think I just closed out of it, is still happening. It's still going. I've just been developing some of the materials at a different pace, and I think we'll have a lot of things will be coming out next week. So stay tuned for that. Just to highlight this, we still have a resource list and a timeline that I'm opening up for people to contribute to. I'm still collecting some resources. I think some big ones are going to be still Margaret Bowden's book and the What Happened to Cognitive Science paper that I reference often for Nunez and et al. And there's a lot of things coming along with that, which has been good. And that and the Neuromatch Slow Pod are basically on the verge of being fully released into the wild. And now that I'm back on vacation, that'll be a good thing. And kind of something that we talked about yesterday, and I'm looking more into how to do it, but I think I'm just going to kind of refer to all these things as, maybe we talked about a name like Futures of Cognition. I was thinking also about something like using the word trajectories, which isn't really as sexy of a word, but is actually really accurate.
Right.
So my trajectories is like an essential component to a lot of stuff that I'm interested in doing. And one of the, we kind of talked about some things I plan on doing this semester, and well, I guess academic year, and we'll have quite a bit in terms of other things that are coming up later in the meeting, which I'm really excited for and look forward to working on and kind of weaving into some of the things here that I'm doing. But one of the deliverables that I'm really working forward towards is what will be in this repo. At least I'm not going to write the paper and other things here, but I'm going to keep an active reading list for this,
Okay.
and I'm going to work on developing. At the very least, I'm going to be writing a survey paper about computational models of cognition, and a lot of the things that go into it. And I've actually been talking about this for quite some time. It just never was really given anything remotely public facing. So now it has this, and what does it look like? I mean, right now I have set up a board for essentially I have a collection of papers, things that I'm reading, and stuff that I'm going to put into a bibliography, and then it'll be done. And I'm just going to keep. I probably have, I don't know, a significant number of papers that aren't here yet, and everything else. But I have definitely been. It's a very crystallized project in my mind, and I know what I'm going to do, and I know how I'm going to do it, and it's been really interesting. One of the first major paper that I'm reading is actually a really interesting story. I don't want to take too much time, but Ron Sun, who I didn't really know who Ron Sun was, but actually I think I put this on. on Twitter. Ronson is actually probably 10 miles away from me right now.
Okay.
He's actually at RPI, and RPI is across the river in Albany here. And this is him. This is he doesn't have a Twitter, but he's at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute.
Right.
And it actually is one of it has one of the few cognitive science, like pure cognitive science labs, and it's a technical tool, but Ronson is, and the book. When I first found the paper, it was the papers. The paper. I'm doing air quotes. The paper. You can see this kind of related to the Human Brain Project education program. The paper, which I think I still have here, was called Introduction to Cognitive Science. And I was like, oh, okay, that's a cool name for a paper. Yes, I would like to see this. But there we go. It looked like, okay, part 1 introduction. And I was like, what is it part 1 of? And it turned out it's the Cambridge Handbook of Computational Psychology. It's outdated in that it's 2008 or 2007 or something like that.
Right.
However, it's really quite interesting in, like, this is actually this isn't really the greatest. I like the other format better. So that's why there were multiple links there, but it's really interesting to look at how things are broken down and discussion of levels of analysis with Mars traditional stuff here and some things that he's proposed. And this is like an interesting way to break down some of the modeling levels of the hierarchy, interagent, agent, intra-agent substrates. Like I think I'm definitely interested in looking at these kind of classification and differences. So I mean, this is sort of a foundational work. A foundational work, and it's outdated. This is all this is way before deep learning took off, but it's something that is really offering a lot of leads, and I might read more of the book, but for introduction and the survey, and also to be incorporated into the reading group at some point, I think it's an interesting piece to have. So I'm kind of collecting those interesting pieces to have, and to go through them here in the process of this, and I'll tie into the actual journal club, which is sort of a more public facing thing, and I think that'll be kind of a social banner under a lot of things that I'm engaging a lot of people with, and that's great. And we're still having some discussion, and even with you and Bradley, this may be a good candidate for that Slack that's a little bit more of an open workspace, and thinking about how to manage some of that, because I know I'm not quite sure. I haven't quite finalized my thoughts about it. I'm not sure if you have yet either, but I think there's a really good there's an interesting group and collection of people and things going on about that. So yeah, that's mostly it from my fun update stuff. There's stuff that you're going to talk about, which I won't overshadow. And let me see. Where's my? Is there a way to stop sharing your screen in it?
Oh.
Like in Gisty?
Well, it stopped sharing. I don't know if it's.
Oh, I just hit the button again. Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. There was talk about some of the gradient.pod work. That's absolutely happening. My major goal this weekend is to get a lot of my. I said this to you yesterday, but to say it here as well. Actually, I'm going to share my screen because because I can basically. Um, Terrible news.
Yeah.
But not talk about that. Uh, this here. This is me realizing, okay, there's a lot of great stuff coming, and I have to just get the really good stuff that's in my head out because I don't. There's just so much stuff that's coming up, and I really want to give it its justice, do it justice, give it the honor it deserves, write it, and I realized if I don't finish my writing that's already in my head this weekend, it might not ever happen.
Yeah.
And I know that's something that comes up a lot of times in writing and research and academia and people who are, doing all kinds of writing projects and whatever. And it's funny, it's like, oh, now it's my time to really experience that again. Because there's just, a lot of stuff to do. And that's how I feel about it. So it was,
Yeah.
I am excited about things to come. This is a very awkward GIF, but
Yes.
yeah. So I guess that's a pretty good segue into what Bradley's going to talk about. So I will bow out and yeah. Any comments about that? But I mean,
Yeah. Yes, I think Ron Sun. I think we cited him in the A-Life workshop paper. I can't remember what the actual citation. It was actually a pretty obscure citation, but we had a. That's where that name was kind of like familiar to me, but I didn't know from where. And then
yeah, and that's what it was for me too, because it was like Ron Sun sounds familiar, and then I didn't realize I had a moment where you're reading the text and you're like, oh, Ron Sun, is the author, but I just like, all right, yeah, he's the author, great. And I didn't realize he's referring to himself.
Yeah.
Which made a lot of sense. Like, geez, he really likes this Sun guy. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's why it makes sense. And then I was like, oh, he's here, and he's actually at RPI, which I looked. RPI is actually it's definitely the place I looked at for graduate school, and I didn't actually make all the connections until I was like, oh, yes, that guy. So again, it's the world of your specific interests really isn't that big as it might seem at times. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I like this idea about the way you're organizing this and that it's coming together. I mean, at least you're putting out some web references and you're getting things organized. And so, I don't know if, it might end up being a collaborative effort. It might just be you putting in references and organizing them. But, don't worry about like who the audience is right now. Just try to set up some infrastructure and see where it goes. And it might just be helpful to you, but it might be helpful to other people.
Yeah. And I think I totally agree with that. And the study group is, I don't think that's going to be, that's my most, hey, you want to come and talk about this? Yes. And people reached out a lot about that to me. So that's great. And I think people are continuing to look for places to talk about that stuff. And honestly, some of the stuff that I'm specifically interested in, it's been cool to see people do that. But at the same time, I don't think I'm going to get 50 contributors to the GitHub or anything like that.
Yeah.
It's just fine. Because it's mostly just a space to have it there and to refer to. And well, I mean, there's some legitimate things they could contribute to, like the resource, especially the timeline. That's definitely going to be an interesting thing for me. And I was debating quite a bit where and how to do that because there's different timeline software and different collaborative things, and Trello boards might even be a good option. But just for the sake of putting it on GitHub, that's there. But yeah, and then I have my specific projects. You kind of know about them, but I have two major projects that are going to be my North Stars for pretty much this semester, this year. And they're going to tie into a lot with what 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 is also going to be talked about next. So yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, we talked about your projects yesterday. I think the two projects that you're proposing are doable, like I said, but I think it's, you might want to really kind of get some writing done and see where, you
Mm.
know, like basically build an outline first. And
Hmm.
then you'll
Yeah.
see it when we go to the projects, the submissions projects that I'm going to present, how you might approach that. Uh,
Yeah. The manuscripts themselves are pretty much. I'm going to start showing them to you in the next week because they're kind of framed out and boxed. But the full outline is sort of the next step, and then bibliography stuff and so on.
yeah, yeah. So I think that's again, just if you do an outline, sometimes you find that like the parts of the outline don't fit. Some parts, maybe you need more detail somewhere. So, you can take the parts that don't fit and spin them off. And then, definitely writing is a good idea, but also outlining things. I just think it's better to have like, to work from like an outline because you can sort things early. You don't have to shape things later. I've known people who write like just write a lot and then have to shape it later, and that's not as effective. Although it can be effective, you know.
Hmm.
Uh, yeah, we'll talk about that along, in the next few weeks. Let's see, what else was I going to mention? I like the way you have it on GitHub. I think I mentioned about reference managers yesterday, and then Mars 3 levels. So you said you might mention that more today.
Oh yeah, it was basically just in the paper. In that I think I don't have a full. Let's see. Well, I won't show my screen again, but basically, I think one of the most interesting things for a lot of my what is currently called the Cognitive Futures subgroup or research team or whatever is like these are macro big frameworks, and I think having a catalog, or at least it's sort of like the comparison of models, like from Neuromatch, like the model, almost like model regimes or model frameworks, and thinking about things within the variations of what they can do and explain. And I think I don't know if we explicitly covered Mars level of analysis in this or in Devo Worm or anything, um, at least that I've seen. But I think it might be. I foresee a discussion happening. I might just make a presentation myself and say, hey, here's Mars. It's always referenced. Neuromatch, iClear, everything that I've been to has referenced Mars level analysis. It's very applicable and very traditional. And it's like there are also, I don't know if they're competing, but just other frameworks as well. And I think I'd like to go through a benefit, like not a benefit, but like just what does this model framework highlight, or what is it? What does it sort of leave out? And that kind of a comparison is really germane to a lot of the things I want to look into, but also I think it's an easy and a very obvious upcoming discussion to have. So
Yeah, I think it's a good way to think about like computational stuff because you're talking about implementing algorithms, and it's like cognitive science. The sort of the history of it sort of thought about the brain as being like sort of an algorithm. So like when you do something, there's an algorithm behind it, a natural algorithm that we don't really, it's not written, but it's like there's a series of sequence of steps that you engage in to do this thing, and then that lends very well to robotics and AI and things like that. And so that's where this kind of three levels sort of comes from. It's you have computations and you have algorithms, implementations. So, you think about it like as like something that happens in the brain that we have to understand. We understand it through some sort of, algorithm that's extracted from that. And then you see the algorithm perform computations, which is like operations in the real world. So, I don't know if you've read a lot of the sort of the human factors literature, the HCI literature, but sometimes they talk about that sort of approach, that way of thinking, where you have like this, your brain is generating these algorithms for doing something, some sequence of tasks, and then the computation is doing the tasks or computing some solution to a problem. And so it's a nice way to think about it. Now, you might say, well, that's just one way to look at it. There's probably, other ways to look at it. Maybe we don't really generate algorithms. Maybe things just happen. Maybe things are more happenstance than that. That's. I don't really know if there's a literature on like people debating Mars 3 levels, especially like in like the cog-sci literature. I'm not sure, but definitely like if you're talking about computational modelers, that's like very tailor fit to that area.
Mm.
Also, have you read anything about like cognitive modeling more generally?
Uh, I don't. I'm not. I'm not sure. I may have, but I don't know what to really reference that might be what that is.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of there are other cognitive models, and I think that's interesting. How like these cognitive models usually are used to explain things in the brain more than like build AI. From like we think of AI, but they are computational models, and they do exist sort of outside the framework of like our machine learning, deep learning thing that everyone talks about these days. And then even outside of the computational neuroscience that you might see at Neuromatch. Neuromatch, they're talking a lot about neurons and, uh, action potentials and things like that. Cognitive models don't really deal with that. They deal with operations. So they deal with this, they draw a box and then they connect the boxes. And so they're operations that the brain carries out. And then those operations are basically the algorithms. And so, that might be something definitely want to include in like a view of cognitive science is this idea that, you can build models at different levels of phenomenology. So like from like neurons to, networks, like network neuroscience to, cognitive models, which are more, processes. So, I mean, there are other, and then even like agent based models, you could say, are just kind of like point models of the brain. So it's like you have an agent that does something and it's not really concerned about the actual cognition or the brain. It just assigns a series of behaviors to an agent. And so, I mean, that's one way to look at it too, is that people approach modeling from different perspectives and levels of understanding. So that has some effect on how we understand cognition, because cognition isn't just something that you arrive at through an action potential or collective of neurons, but you also have processes. You have embodiment, which some cognitive models deal explicitly with embodiment. You have Bradenburg vehicles, which are good toy models of like an embodied system, and then you have other models that model maybe social cognition is a good term. So yeah, I think that's something to think about too. Um,
Yeah, definitely. All that is yes.
yeah. So thanks for that update. That was good. I think that'll be something to keep following through. If people have questions about that, you can contact Jesse. Still, he's still kind of hashing things out, but I think he's got a good path. The gradient paper or the gradient article, yeah, send it to me. Send a draft to me when you're ready on that. I'll take a look at it. I'd like to see it like in pretty good shape before we actually submit it. But I just want to take a look at it. If it's in pretty decent shape, so we can kind of. I mean, I want to get a sense of what the angle is you're taking at this.
Oh yeah. I'm aiming to have. I want to have all that stuff done by this weekend, and what I mean by done is I have a blog post which is like very adjacent to the main. Well, I have a NeuroMatch blog post, and that's still going to happen, like a full one just about NeuroMatch, and then the iClear article with like allusions to NeuroMatch or whatever. I really want to have like a good draft of that done either by tonight or tomorrow, like a full draft, and then I'm sure we'll review it a bit, and then we can go from there. But that has to, like, even if it changes, like I'm gonna kind of I'll send you an outline maybe after this meeting. Actually, I should have done that like yesterday, but I want to get as much out of my head this weekend as I possibly can. Like that's like I've successfully identified that as like critical and vital to my well-being. So I'm gonna try to do as much of that as I can. Like I think especially Sundays, I'm just gonna write all day long. So
yeah. I think that's it's again, people have different ways of writing. I think like doing having like periods devoted to writing is good because you can really get into it in your headspace, and so that's good. Thank you for that. Let's see. I have a couple things I want to talk about before I go on to conference submissions. So first of all, let me go through the this is the complex. Oh, let me share my screen here. Oops. So I want to go through the complexity of feedback loops.
Oh yes, that is still happening too.
So this, again, we have our repository, and we had some discussion with Aksh and Suniti on the using these data for different things. Jesse expressed some interest in it as well. So, I think we can make something happen here. I just want to point out that we have all the stuff in place. We have the data set. We have the notebook. So this is how to set up the data. This is IBL data loading. So I think this one is the one you want to use if you want to extract the data from the main raw data set. Accessing data tells you how to kind of do this, and it gives you some data set type descriptions. So this is actually the description of all the variables here that you get. And then we want to not only just describe the data, but we want to actually design an analysis that will, answer some question and maybe pose some hypotheses. So again, we have the zero order representation, which is just a simple stimulus response. First order representation, which is a simple feedback. Higher order representation, which is behavioral tuning, where you have a stimulus response and the response is graded somehow. And so this is, of course, the thing we can answer well with these data, because you have a sort of a behavioral paradigm where the mouse is answering, like responding to a stimulus, but also making a judgment on its relative strength or something like that. And so, again, I would recommend reading through the paper again before we really delve into the analysis too deeply. But just to make sure that you know what the variables mean in the context. So that's NeuroMatch Academy, the complexity of feedback loops. We also have...
And the paper's in that repo too? or the link to it?
I don't know if I put the link in there. I think I did, but
Okay. If not, I'll add it.
yeah, it's the IBL mouse data sets, IBL mouse project. So it's something that can easily be found.
Yeah.
So these are conference submissions. So I've made text files, templates for each of the two papers, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So this is where the text templates live for NeurIPS. The NeuroMatch abstracts are going to be here. So I'll talk about those. And then our ideas for submission, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's what's going on in GitHub. Now I wanted to maybe discuss a few papers here. So this is the first thing I wanted to talk about, and this was from last week, following up on Ujwal's paper idea. So I wanted to mention something I was thinking about during his presentation, and one caveat we want to think about is it has to do with this Google Flu Trends work. And so Google Flu Trends was something that was maybe 2007, 2008 timeframe, where they noticed that if there's a flu outbreak somewhere, you can look at the trends of the outbreak by looking at the Google search results for a certain area. So in this case, you see that in South Africa, there are flu trends, and it roughly corresponds to the flu season. So when people get the flu, the idea is they Google the symptoms, and then you can track those search terms and watch in real time as you get spikes of search terms, and then you get a spike in flu cases. So this, you might think of this as causal, but it isn't actually that. It actually isn't as causal as you might think. So it turns out that you can monitor millions of users' health tracking behaviors. You can use Google search queries, and you can do these analyses of, frequency of search terms to find some sort of correspondence with flu outbreaks, maybe predict them. This is maybe kind of like some of the stuff they're trying to do with COVID, like the sequencing water from sewage treatment plants to find like clusters of COVID or community transmission in some areas. It's an aggregate method, but it's maybe indicative of some type of signal that you might be able to use to identify things in the in the world. But the problem, of course, with using it as a predictive tool and maybe as a causal tool is that those search terms don't always trend sort of synchronously with the flu. So they do, they have a methodology that they use. And then what they find is that sometimes it works, and sometimes you underestimate the number of cases. So you can look at for an outbreak by using these terms, but you end up getting, you can use what they did was they used Google Flu Trends to predict things off of a CDC data set, and it was 97% accurate. But sometimes, in some cases, those predictions can be fairly inaccurate. So for the interval 2011 to 2013, and I remember seeing this at a conference, I remember hearing about the Google Flu Trends and then being a little bit skeptical. And then a couple of years after that, they had this period where it was very non-predictive, where it was it predicted twice as many doctor's visits as the CDC actually recorded. Now, that might be that, people don't go to the doctor every time they have the flu. Not every flu case you go to the doctor, but there is this, and you can see why, kind of, because if you're using search terms to predict something like that, people might be searching for symptoms for something that, like flu symptoms, but they might be that they're for some other thing that they have. So not all flu symptoms are just, limited to the flu, but also, they might, because it's flu season, they might be Googling these terms to understand what they are, or, they might be thinking about them. So you never know why people are doing the search. It's just that the search happens. And so, but it may also be that, people are hearing about people with the flu, so they're trying to find out if they have a symptom or what the symptoms are. So it's imperfect. But this is the kind of thing that I think we have to keep in mind when we do these kind of, data-driven explorations of things, thinking about causality. Is it really predictive, first of all, in every case? Is it broadly predictive? And then secondly, we can't assume that something that we find in a study like this is causal. There are a lot of different things that could be going on. And so sometimes, the fit looks pretty good and you could say, well, that's causal. And then in other cases, it might not fit well at all. And so in those cases, then it isn't causal. So there are a lot of techniques that people use for looking at understanding causality. And, this is an interesting sort of approach to predicting flu trends. But I think you have to make that distinction between prediction and causality. So that's that paper. Another paper I found was this varieties of representation in evolved and embodied neural networks. So this is something that from the it's more philosophy of science oriented here. So in this paper, I discuss one of the key issues in the philosophy of neuroscience, neurosemantics. The project of neurosemantics involves explaining what it means for states of neurons and neural systems to have representational contents. Neurosemantics thus involves issues of common concern between the philosophy of neuroscience and the philosophy of mind. I discuss a problem that arises for accounts of representational content that I call the economy problem, or the problem of showing that a candidate theory of mental representation can bear the work required within the causal economy of a mind and an organism. My approach in the current paper is to explore this and other key themes in neurosemantics through the use of computer models of neural networks, embodied and evolved in virtual organisms. This model allows for the laying bare of the causal economies of entire yet simple artificial organisms, so that the relations between the neural bases of, for instance, representation and perception and memory can be regarded in the context of an entire organism. So this is the idea of this paper. I don't know if he has any figures in here. So it basically approaches this idea of representation and causality using these virtual organisms. And so this is kind of what we're doing with Bratenberg vehicles to an extent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He calls this the economy problem. So the various authors of competing theories of representational content have done relatively little to spell out how their naturalized representations would live and breathe in the economy of a single mind, yet alone in the network of forces contributing to the well-functioning of an entire organism. Call this the economy problem. So raising this as a problem is not to deny that philosophers have paid a certain amount of lip service to the importance of such causal relationships. The complaint is that they've supplied insufficient information to show a mental representation that's defined in a certain way can combine to constitute a mind and control an organism. So this is the idea that you have this representation and it exists in the brain, but does it really do anything in terms of behavior? And so there is this issue of, like, is this representation that you're proposing, does it actually have a consequence on behavior, and does it really fit well to the behavior? So this view is held aloft by the belief that the success, or at least popularity, of cognitive science vindicates the representational theory of mind. So he cites Fodor, and he goes on about some of the representational aspects. This is, again, they don't talk about a lot about neurons here. He's using a lot of examples from, like, reasoning. And so these questions concerning representation are pursued here by employing a cognitive science methodology come to be known recently as bottom-up AI, or the animat approach. So we haven't talked about animats, but these are basically like artificial organisms that you can use to, they can be robots, they can be on a computer screen, but they basically allow you to model the brain in the context of an entire organism. And that's not a very common term, although there was a series of books from animals to animats many years ago. And this citation, Guyot and Mayer, 2001, that might be a good reference. It may be actually the book I was thinking about. So if we go down to references here, the animat contribution to cognitive systems research. So it's not animals to animats, but it's a different, it's in Journal of Cognitive Systems Research. So that's maybe a paper to check out, just in terms of thinking about animats, or like, maybe we can go ahead and, talk about animats in another meeting. But so this is a graph here of looking at how animats do this thing. So these are kind of like artificial life organisms. It's more than just kind of like a cognitive model or a model of neurons. It's actually where they're doing things in an environment. So here you have water depth versus average lifetime distance. So this is the performance of 2D and 3D food finders in water of varying depths. So you can see that there's this 2D animat that has a certain performance curve at shallow water depths, and then their performance goes way down in deeper water depths. And then the 3D case is actually pretty stable. So you can do this sort of thing where you're building like these, animats of different dimensions, and you're having them do tasks in a sort of a naturalistic environment. So I think there's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot about history, and
yeah. It seems like a really interesting paper, and that'll be on my reading list for a few things for sure.
So I guess he says, please do not cite, but it may be published now, so I don't know where I got this. I think I got it off the web somewhere. I had done some literature search, but yeah, this is definitely maybe something you should check out. There's another paper here I think I'm going to talk about, which is Gulliver's Virtual Travels, Active Embodiment in Extreme Body Sizes for Modulating Our Body Representations. And this one is interesting because it involves virtual reality and changes in body representation. So the abstract says, it is noted that the perceptual experience of the body in space can be modulated by changing the action capabilities, or by manipulating the perceived body dimensions through multisensory stimulation. This study adds to the pre-existing literature by investigating the alterations in bodily experience following embodiment to both enlarged and shrunken bodies, while participants actively navigated in a virtual environment. So your avatar, I guess, was shrunken down or enlarged relative to a body size. So if you were in an environment with buildings and you had a normal body size, your avatar would be larger or smaller. That's the idea, I think.
I wish Anson was here, because this is like big time what he would. This is definitely an Anson paper.
Yeah.
And I mean, just from the sound of it so far, but I'll mention that to him for sure.
Yeah, we can revisit this paper next week. I just wanted to go over it real quick as a kind of wetting the whistle. After each embodied navigation, participants estimated the height and width of 3 different body parts. The results revealed that the embodiment over shrunk bodies include a significant reduction in participants' body image, while no changes are reported after the embodiment over the enlarged body. Findings were discussed in terms of the previous literature exploring the constraints and implicated the ownership over different bodies. So this actually used a virtual environment where they simulated body sizes. So you would have like let's see, how did they do this actually? I'm going to make sure I understand this. So they're using this virtual full body illusion. and they're using this avatar to represent the body size changes. So let's see. There's one example where individuals experienced to be the owner of a doll body, a body of 30 centimeters. They perceived objects to be larger and farther away. Consistently, when participants were immersed in a giant body, 400 centimeters, objects are experienced as smaller and nearer. So our body seems to serve as a perceptual ruler we use to measure the apparent size of external objects. So you're in a virtual environment, you see external objects, your avatar is a certain size, and then you're controlling the avatar, and because you're using that avatar to manipulate objects or observe them, you make different estimates in terms of the size and distance of those objects. So it's like you're building this representation of the body in your head, or you're building off of your existing body representation and you're interpreting things in a different context, but you're doing it in a way that's consistent with this sort of homuncular flexibility. So you have this representation of the body. Sometimes people call it a homunculus, which is this representation of call it proprioception or sensing the body in all its parts. So if you've ever seen those maps where they have a big head and big hands and then a small mid section or trunk, that's what they call homuncular map. It's like they have these little gremlins. They look like gremlins, but they're actually these models of how much of the body, what parts of the body are represented in the homunculus. So if you have a lot of nerve endings in your head and in your face, your head and your face are overrepresented in the homunculus. The midsection doesn't have as dense concentration of proprioceptors and other types of things like nociceptors. So your homunculus is smaller there. And so you use that representation to do this sort of these estimations, but you're using the avatar to put everything in context. And so, so it's this giant versus small individual. So you have this, then they had a self-report where participants were asked to explicitly measure or explicitly report the effects of the illusion as it regards sense of ownership, the experience of the body as mine, sense of agency, the feeling of control over my actions, and self-location, where I believe my body is. And so there's this idea, the illusion is grounded on a visual motor coherence between participants' movements and virtual actions. And so this is why this happens. So this is a really good, so this is an example here, an image where they're in a virtual environment and they have hands of different sizes. And so this whole, this experiment result resides on this avatar's size relative to the objects. So I don't want to get too deeply into this paper again because Anson's not here and because we have to move on to the other thing. So, you were going to say something?
Oh, excuse me. No, just that I think it's a really, it's not really active right now, and we're not talking a lot about VR stuff, but I know you've done a lot of work in that area before, and I think that's definitely, it really gets at a fascinating for me. We'll hear about VR and empathy and whatever, it can help with that and different studies and different things, therapies that involve VR stuff. But I think it's a very interesting medium for looking at certain things. It's the most interesting medium for exploring certain self-referencing perceptions and how they can actually be potentially augmented or getting at creating enough of a difference, even if it's simulated, where you can look at something. So more about that all the time, but I'm definitely glad that those things continue to come up in these discussions.
Yeah. So those are the papers, and then finally, can you see my screen here?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So now finally, I wanted to talk about the conference submissions. Let's see, present. Might as well present. This is the conference submissions. We have a repository for conference submissions, and that's where I showed you those templates for LaTeX. So we're going to be submitting to NeurIPS, as I said. We'll talk more about these submissions. So the first submission we want to make is this NeuroMatch submission on developmental AI. And this is the idea that I think Jesse was alluding to earlier, where we have some work that's been done on developmental Bradenburg vehicles and other areas, and we have a general interest in development. So we're going to try to make like a NeuroMatch, a 200 to 300 word abstract submission by October 2nd, and that's in about 2 weeks. And I think Jesse and Rishbab were interested in doing this. And then another, well, I don't have that slide here, but the other NeuroMatch submission then is this idea of non-neuronal cognition. So this is actually associated with DevoWorm. This is, again, due in 2 weeks, and it's a 200 to 300 word abstract. And this is where we have the diatom basilaria. So it's a multicellular colonial organism. And the idea is, can we interpret movement behavior as a quasi-neuronal information processing system? So we don't have neurons, but we have cells that behave as synchronized oscillators. And we have these data on behavior that we can draw from to say something about the movement of the colonies and how that we might build a model around that. It's, again, they don't have a nervous system, but we want to think about it in terms of psychophysics and sort of a quasi-neuronal model. It's information processing by these cells. And so we might use different measurement techniques. We might look for, say, for example, input-output relationships or active perception in cells. And we might measure this using statistical tools such as signal detection theory or fold change detection, which are techniques we haven't covered in the group here, but we can use them. They're basically signal detection theory is a way to measure the existence of signal, the relationship between signal and noise. And fold change detection is the change between like maybe signal and noisy output. And so you can measure those using different equations. And we might also establish an input-output curve that determines how much input results in a corresponding degree of output. So you'll see in these colonies that there's like some input that's put in at like one end of the colony with one of the cells. And what happens is one cell moves and it slides the other cells along with it. And there's a sort of rhythmic chain reaction that goes on between all the cells in the colony. So one cell moves, another cell moves along with it, and it pulls the entire colony along. And so we can look at those sorts of things. We can also look at each cell as like what they call a Kuramoto oscillator, which is something they use to look at synchronized neural activity. If we build a connectionist model of this, in other words, if we have like all the cells connected in different ways, we can look at these nodes as neuronal units, and they can act as neuronal oscillators. And there may be something we're calling a collective pattern generator, which is like like a central pattern generator, but it's specialized for non-neuronal systems. Then these connections can be determined by the relative degree of synchronization between neighboring cells. So as the cells behave in a synchronized or asynchronous fashion, we can determine the connectivity between them. And then we have basically what amounts to a connectionist model. And then we can go from there. I don't really, it's a little fuzzy in my mind still how this is going to work, but we only have to submit the abstract by the 2nd. I think actual NeuroMatch conference is like at the end of the month. So this network allows us to build an internal model of the behavior of these colonies with inputs, outputs, processing units, and interactions. And so that's for NeuroMatch. And so the first one I mentioned was this developmental AI, and I didn't give any detail on that. The detail on that has to do with this Baby Minds workshop. And so this is the link to the Baby Minds call for papers. And we talked about this last week. The due date is actually October 2nd, so it's the same day as the NeuroMatch submissions. Our deliverable here is a 4-page paper with references and an appendix. And I have at least 4 people interested in this, I think. Rashab, Akshara, Jesse, and maybe Anson. But the idea is to kind of make something that goes beyond the NeuroMatch submission. So the NeuroMatch submission on developmental AI will be rather broad, but this will be more focused. This is a longer version of the NeuroMatch submission. And so we want to maybe look a little bit more at the developmental Bradenberg vehicle paradigm, where we have this developmental architecture with embodiment built in. And one of the questions we might ask is, how do you develop a connectome to behave or for behavior? And so we have innate components, which could be, gene expression networks or these connectomes, the cells within the connectomes. We also have generative and constructivist elements. So the generative aspect is the developmental process. The innate aspect are these cells, maybe with gene expression networks inside them. And the constructivist view allows us to assemble these behaviors together, or these outputs into behaviors. And so this is the idea, this basic developmental framework. We're trying to go beyond the Bradenberg vehicle itself to kind of, build upon each part of this. So we think of development as both this thing that happens in time and this organizational principle. But we also want to have this critical periods focus. So we want to take the stuff from the critical periods discussion and incorporate it as well. So during the developmental process, in the introduction, expansion, manipulation of critical periods, which are these periods where you have a lot of learning, a great amount of plasticity, but it's only for a limited time in development. Does this play a role in the expression of behavior? And I don't know if people have talked about this. I don't think people have talked about this really at all in like the NeurOps community. The people in this workshop will probably be talking about humans a lot. So this will be a departure from that. So I think if we combine the sort of perspective where we lay out the sort of the components of the DBV and then talk about critical periods as a way to understand the developmental process itself, it's not uniform. It, builds upon one thing, builds upon another. And then you have these critical periods where there are things that happen, in a very quick period of time. And, if you introduce critical periods, say, at the beginning of the developmental process versus later in the developmental process, that's got to have some sort of an effect on on the output of the adult Bradenberg vehicle. And so that's the idea for this paper. And let me know if you're interested. I have some names here, but I want to confirm with everyone.
Yes, it's definitely very cool.
Yeah. So this is what the topics of interest. So I think we're within this range of possibilities. We have, let's see, neurocognitive learning systems. We have developmental cognitive robotics. We might fit into embodied concept learning, although that's a bit of a stretch. But I think we're definitely within this whole area. So this is going to be interesting. Hopefully it gets accepted. But if it doesn't get accepted, we can also do another paper. And we've got kind of to do it at the same time. But, it gives us 2 shots at this. So we have Beyond Backprop, the Novel Ideas for Training Neural Architectures workshop. This is the link here, Beyond Backprop at GitHub.io. This is another workshop that has a different focus. The due date on this is October 9th, so it's another week. Another 4-page paper, but this is, again, we can write this in concert and share ideas so that it's not a huge burden. And then interested, we have Rashab, Akshar, and Jesse, maybe. And so this focuses more on the metabrain models idea. So this would be where you have metabrain models that combine 2 or more models in a layered fashion. So we did this at the workshop this summer with developmental Brainberg vehicles and contextual geometric structures. We have this layering involves two or more distinct levels of representation. So, one of our layers is a limit, has a limited representational content. So the developmental Brainberg vehicles are pretty limited in terms of their representation. Whereas we can add in this what we're doing here is we're taking one of these low representation models and adding a higher representation model on top of it, and we're allowing for interactions between those two layers, and that's how you end up with something that's sort of bootstrapped from like a standard neural network to something that has a little bit more context and semantic value to it. So we have things that sit above this developmental Brainberg vehicle. We might have something like an observer-dependent model, which I talked about last week. Sitting above that, even, we might have a representation-heavy model of context. So we could use, a contextual geometric structure. And then but then the question is, and we didn't really answer this in the A-Life paper, was how do we represent the interface between layers? These are, that's an important question, because if you have two layers that are interacting, how do you represent the flow of information going from one to the other? It's much like in the brain where you have different layers of the cortex, but they actually have columns that allow you to move between the layers. And those columns are actually important for processing in their own right. And so, I don't want to go to the columns argument, but we can, I think maybe that's a place to focus for this paper, would be to talk about that sort of columnar organization, to make clear it isn't like columns of cortex, but like that's the approach. And so, we have this hybrid model, and we're using these they're orthogonal to the layers. They're sort of columnar, but they have their own sort of properties. So that would be the idea there. So then that's for the submissions. So then we have other things to catch up on. We have a talk series from all the talks in Saturday Morning NeuroSim here. There's no deadline on that, but we need to organize these, and perhaps we could incorporate it into something like the cognitive discussion group, where we'd have all these references or resources for people. Since they're already created, you just curate and organize them. So it's like you have maybe like a web page where they're all listed, and there are links to the slides. And I don't know, but there definitely is some theme there, because I did a lot of talks for leading up to NeuroMatch and then after NeuroMatch on different topics: information theory, agent-based models, the observer-dependent model one I did last week. Those are all, I think, pretty. They bring up really interesting issues, and so we might do something like that. We might actually even do a paper on the supplemental education aspect of NeuroMatch Academy. So I know NeuroMatch Academy is working on some papers for, like, how did you organize this summer school in like 2 months sort of thing. And it's like, we can, I don't know if it's like even worth doing, but we might organize like a white paper on the supplemental ed aspect of NeuroMatch Academy. So that's another thing. And then there are other opportunities, of course. The feedback loops and data set plan. We want to do there is aim for a manuscript. We want to design an analysis with firm questions, and then write up a manuscript based on that analysis. So, I mean, that's something that is longer term. I've also run across this thing, Cyber Cafe Scientifique. I don't know. I have to submit a proposal for it, but I don't know. It's
Where
like
is that something that came up from? I know it's familiar, but I don't know where that term.
Oh, I don't know. It's like something I found when I was doing some research, and it's just like a virtual talk on some topic.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
I'll have to get more detail about it later. I just put it down. It's not due till December, so it's not really on the front burner. And then this Philosopher's Webs Cafe, which is something that Jesse got me interested in. And I'm thinking of doing this, following up on the observer dependent models idea for that. It's very philosophical, so I think they'd enjoy it. But I have to go and propose that, and that'll be longer term as well. So that's all I have for that, and I hope that was useful, because I think, especially for the things we're doing with the submissions, I think that'll be. So I mean, that's going to be like next couple weeks is going to be like putting all that together and sending it out, but it should be worth it.
Yeah, I'm curious about all that. And then you mentioned the supplemental education white paper thing in Neuromatch. Do you have anywhere where they're like talking about what papers they're writing? Because I've seen a little bit here and there, but I don't know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, I think they have a channel for that in the Neuromatch Slack, and I don't know what the actual name of it is right now, but there is a channel in there that they've devoted to talking about that. But I think they're planning on different papers, like for how do we create the educational materials and all that.
Yeah, and then like obviously like as I mentioned to you before, like I'm super interested in that specific aspect of things, like because I think there's another conversation to have at a different time, but like where education's going, and Neuromatch is a really interesting part of that. So yeah, all that there's a lot of stuff going on. That's why I want to get my writing out of the way. As I do, obviously also graduate school application stuff is in the mix, and I'm not even talking about it, but like that's a big thing. So I'm gonna be really busy for the next while. Like I've had my summer vacation, and it's definitely over now. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for meeting. So next week, I don't know what we'll do. We'll probably hopefully have a better turnout. We'll talk more about the submissions, and if you have an update, would like to hear it.
Oh yeah, I think I'll have an update, and I'm going to be talking to some of the people. I check in with as just general lab manager stuff. I'll kind of be checking in with people, and if you could, what might be really good to do is just post some of those. I don't know if you want to post directly the slides, or like I'll take a screenshots of the slides or something that talk about the projects, because just so people see them really easily and know that they can, we're doing this, and I think there's a lot of interest and want to do that. So I think it's like, hey, if this is actually happening right now, you can help us submit this. I think that'll be like, that'll turn out some things. So
yeah, definitely. Okay, well, thanks for meeting again. I'll talk to you next week.
Yep, have a good weekend, and happy fall and all that stuff that's coming up.
Yeah, happy fall. Have a good weekend.